Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here, and in this episode of Pedalhead, I'm discussing one of the earliest, most simple, and yet most important effect circuits in all of electric guitar history, the Dallas Rangemaster Treble Booster. You guys asked, and so you shall receive. Though I was a little surprised, to tell you the truth. On the last installment of this video series, I asked whether you wanted to see this or the full tone OCD first, and the overwhelming response was for this boost pedal. And I have to agree with another commenter, this may not be as popular in terms of view count as the upcoming episode will be, but I think this is an important one. It's one I've been wanting to go over for a very long time. Now, for those of you that are familiar with the Dallas Rangemaster, know that this is not it. This is indeed a clone of that circuit with a few enhanced modifications. I got this from a seller on Reverb by the name of George. You can check out his shop below. Has a lot of cool stuff. He's a pedal builder. He's made something like 600 plus, ranging from tube screamer designs to tremolos to fuzzes to stuff like this. I think he even has another one of these pedals in a different enclosure. And you can go buy that if you want to. All really fairly priced, pretty cool stuff. But what I will say before we get started is if you're the typical plug straight into a 5150 or boost a dual rectifier with a tube screamer kind of player, this ain't your video. Please stick around if you're interested in the history of this kind of effects stuff, or if you just so happen to like playing vintage guitar as well, then that's awesome. But this is not an effect that I would be using for 7/8 string material by any stretch of the imagination. But again, it's still a very important one. It has a really cool sound, and because of that, it's one that I've been wanting to get my hands on for a while. So let's kick it off. When I say the phrase treble booster, that implies a fairly vague effect. You know, anyone can grab a clean boost pedal or any pedal with a tone stack for that matter and turn up the treble and ta-da, we've got a treble booster, right? Yes, but not really, because when we're talking about the Rangemaster, I'm going to try to continue to call it the Rangemaster circuit from here on out. It handles the frequency spectrum and your guitar's electronics and how it boosts its signal in a very specific way. So if you're Google searching for a treble booster, you're probably looking at derivatives of this circuit. Yes, you can take a graphic EQ pedal and boost treble, but it does not have the same sound, the same distortion characteristics, the same interaction with your guitar in the way that this circuit does, and that's why this deserves its own standalone video. The original incarnations of the Dallas Rangemaster were produced in the mid to late 60s and continued to get plenty of playtime all the way up to the late 70s and beyond, and they actually came in a set top box format that you kind of plopped on top of your Plexi half stack or even on your Vox combo amp. This was kind of before the whole pedal craze was a thing. The few pedals that started to emerge around those times were huge before eventually being shrunk down. So that's why that was kind of an always on effect. This was something that you could not bypass. It has a single level control, its own power cable, and you're meant to put it directly between your guitar and your amplifier. Of course, as these things got phased out over the years and people started looking for those effects again, you had companies like Analog Man that shrunk it down into a small bite-sized pedal and actually used standardized center negative 9-volt power supplies. And so nowadays you can find clones of this circuit ranging from the budget-friendly $40 tier all the way up to full-blown new old stock replicas by the British pedal company for around $500, $600 last I looked, US that is. It still beats out the outrageous prices of the original though, so if you're, a pedal collector or want something similar, then, that still may be a viable route for you. I ended up going with something that is kind of the best of both worlds for me in terms of authenticity and its own flavor. This was, again, made by the aforementioned pedal builder on Reverb, And yes, you guessed that right. This is in an electrical wall socket enclosure, donned with green spray paint. It smelled like, spray paint for like 3 days after I got it, which was a cool touch. It even has a solid faceplate as the backing, and I gotta tell you, I think this is genius because there's plenty of holes that are already drilled out that you can use if you want to throw on toggle switches and controls like that. Obviously, you gotta make a couple more for the input-output, but it's got a cool vibe. It looks nice. The depth is just right for any other pedal board applications, and I think best of all for builders, these things are dirt cheap compared to the cost of enclosures for something like this. So mad props for that. I was actually very impressed to see it, and it works, and its build quality is really great. Of course, just like the real Rangemaster, you got a single potentiometer here, which this has little miniature detents in, and it feels so nice to use. You don't have to worry about your settings ever slipping, if you were to touch it on accident. And then we've got this little toggle switch here, which we'll get into greater detail in a moment. But for now, this is kind of what determines how trebly this treble booster is, with the center being the original circuit specs, the bottom kind of being a little more mid-range heavy, and the top being a full range. So that's why if you Google search for stuff like this, you'll often see forum posts about a full range treble booster, which yes, is an oxymoron, but what they mean is a treble booster circuit like this that just so happens to take advantage of the full frequency spectrum. So we'll talk about why that's important in a moment. So some of you at this point might be asking yourself, why on earth would you want to just boost treble anyway? Because when we talk about drive pedals nowadays, you've got pedals like this and other tube screamer derivatives with a tone control that are all centered around mid frequencies, whether we're talking about 700 to 1000 hertz. Generally around that area is the sweet spot for boosting amplifiers when we're talking about a raw guitar signal. Well, you got to remember, back in the time period when this was being sold, the amps that were being produced and played, especially around the British Isles, were Vox AC30s, Marshall JTM 45s, all amplifiers that were not master volume, meaning that if you wanted to get preamp distortion or distortion in general out of these kind of amps, you had to crank the preamp volume. And if you get to that, ear bleeding territory and you can somehow stand it, or you're playing a large enough venue where that makes sense, then you'll still find that the low end can get really flubby on a lot of these amps. That's what some people may not have experienced with these kind of tube amplifiers, because on master volume amps like this, I can roll this off to 2 or 3, crank the preamp volume, you get a lot of preamp distortion, it doesn't get all flubby and nasty on the power amp, life's good. But not so on a lot of those amplifiers. So in order to combat that, they came up with this kind of unit to not only add a level boost so you could achieve that hard-hitting preamp tube distortion earlier, but you also end up cutting a lot of those not so nice bass frequencies. And even some amplifiers took a stab at doing this all in one enclosure, like the Vox Top Boost. So same sort of philosophy, and it really does translate to what we do today when we boost a flubby high gain amplifier into full saturation and cut out a lot of that bass territory. We're doing basically the same thing, and they were doing it 50 years ago at this point. So the philosophy remains the same. It's how they're doing it. what gear they were using and what sound they were ultimately trying to achieve that changed. Now, as you might expect, just like with any modern pedal, not all guitars work well with this circuit. Not all amplifiers work well. So there was a lot of simple modifications done over the years by guitarists and their techs to make these play better with their own setup. So without further ado, let's get into the circuit and why it sounds the way it does. Now, given the somewhat unconventional way this pedal works, I unfortunately can't provide a lot of the same frequency response data that I usually have in these videos. We'll still go over, stuff like the waveform, and of course I'll have demonstrations as always, but I'm gonna have to turn to a third-party source on some of this, and just some of it being hand calculations, which is fine because the source we're looking at is an excellent one with Electrosmash. They have an absolutely awesome write-up on the Dallas Rangemaster. They have all kinds of good stuff, whether it be like the Boss DS1 or the Tube Screamer. Go check them out. I'll link the article in the description and go show them some love. But regardless of whether or not you care about this circuit stuff, the main things I want you to take away for how to use this pedal and how it affects your playing is, number one, how it affects the frequency response in general of your guitar. Number two, how it loads down your guitar electronics on a fundamental level and changes the feel, the sound of your instrument. And number three, how it boosts your level and how you can run out of headroom and actually achieve some tube-like breakup out of an otherwise solid state component. I've said it before and I'll continue to say it, the Rangemaster circuit is among the most simple guitar effects out there. For those of you that may not be too involved with this kind of stuff, here's a picture of the schematic for a Dallas Rangemaster treble booster. Here's a schematic for your run-of-the-mill Tube Screamer, which is at least simple enough that countless builders have copied it for their own designs. And this is a Mesa Boogie amplifier. Yeah, so comparatively, this is a walk in the park. And that is why even those big boxes that the Dallas Rangemasters used to come in were mostly empty. I mean, it's all point-to-point wiring, and a lot of that was simply empty space, which is why they were able to take something like that, shrink it down into pedal formats that are like this size or even smaller. So we're talking about a circuit that has 3 resistors, 3 capacitors, well, 4 if you count the power section. You got the integral amplification stage, standard in and out. There's really not much more to it than that. To echo the wisdom of JHS Pedals owner Josh Scott, when we're talking about a pedal this simple, every little part matters. If we have something like a Super Overdrive or a Blues Drive or a DS1, you can go in there and change little components, resistor here, capacitor there, and you might get a noticeable effect. Maybe. And that's if you go far outside enough of the tolerance. But in general, changing 1 or 2 little parts here and there isn't really going to matter. Having the perfect op amp really isn't going to matter. When we're talking about something that has like a dozen pieces in total, you're going to notice a difference. It will absolutely make a sonic difference to the sound, and that's why a lot of people were able to so easily modify these things and get the tone they were looking for. But with that in mind, I guarantee you my treble booster is going to sound different than one that you get. All electronic components have some sort of tolerance and error associated with them to some extent, but there's especially one core component in here that lends its own character in this circuit, and it's to a point where if you go too far outside of an acceptable boundary, you might get something that doesn't even sound like a treble booster. So you have to be careful if you do want to replicate the circuit on your own. But let's go through this on sort of a high level and talk about the parts that really matter when it comes to making the sound that this thing does. And that's starting with capacitor number 1, which is generally around a range of 5 nanofarads. You see, if you do some quick RC circuit math and you take the stock value of this capacitor, you'll find that it creates a high-pass filter with a cutoff frequency of about 2600 hertz. And that is into scratchy, really trebly raw guitar tone. And that just might work for a lot of players, especially if you're playing through one of those aforementioned dark amplifiers and a dark pair of humbuckers. But if you're someone like Tony Iommi, who turned his amps all the way up to 10, middle and treble to 10, backed off bass completely, presence to 10. He started off on single coil Stratocasters, eventually moving on to single coil P90 equipped SGs. then you don't want more treble. If anything, you want more mids and even more bass with the way that he played and the way he dialed in his gear. So what you can do is replace this input capacitor and change that high pass filter. And in fact, if you say put a 100 nanofarad capacitor there, you'll get something with a cutoff frequency of 130-ish hertz, which is pretty good for the slope that this has. It's still, kind of mid-heavy, and it does take away a lot of the low-end chunk, but depending on your rig again, then that may be wanted. By all accounts, though, Tony's tech actually installed a capacitor that allowed it to be more full range. So by my reverse math, that comes out to be something like a microfarad, or that or anything higher would put you at a cutoff frequency of like 13 hertz. So that's below the audio spectrum anyway. So this one actually has something like 22 microfarads on this position. The center position is closer to 5 nanofarads. Which again makes it the stock treble booster sound. And this one I couldn't actually read. The circuit board's pretty tight in there, but it falls somewhere in between the two. A lot of common values are like 47, 100 nanofarads, depending on how aggressive you want it to sound. But that is a hugely important mod that makes this actually workable on any guitar, because as I'll show in demonstrations, I use this for maybe 1 or 2 very specific use cases. The full range boost is what makes this thing magical. And it's why I'm trying not to call it the treble booster circuit, because at this point it's no longer treble boosting, it's full range, but it's a very important tonal tool for the kind of sounds we're going after here. The second major thing to note about this circuit is the transistor it uses. And there's really nothing special about that in and of itself. I mean, we have pedals all the time on here that use some sort of transistor to make their gain sounds, whether it be JFETs or MOSFETs or even solid state amplifier heads that replace the tubes with transistors to kind of mimic that sound. And they do a pretty decent job at that. However, instead of employing a silicon transistor, which became more common and preferred in pedal designs later on, this is actually using a germanium transistor. So it's a slightly rarer element. But what is more important is the way that this thing behaves, because germanium transistors were even kind of on the outs by the time that these original Rangemasters were being built, but they have a couple quirky things about them. You may have even heard tales of prominent germanium transistor fuzz players sticking their pedal in the freezer for 10 minutes before tracking with it because it sounded different. And that is an absolute effect. These things are really temperature sensitive. The general go-to message on these is don't play them in really hot temperatures, or hell, anything above like 82 degrees Fahrenheit, because they start to gate out really badly. And so that's why this one will not be leaving this studio. Then if I were a touring musician or wanted to use one on a portable board, I would absolutely go the silicon route. One's not better than the other, besides that problem in particular. It's just if you design a good circuit around it, it will work. But the other couple things to note about this is the input on this transistor is extremely low. When you add up the impedance of those parallel resistors in the transistor, you get an input impedance that's almost 99% lower than the impedance you'd find on most contemporary pedals. So, in something like a Boss Stomp box, we're looking at about 1 mega ohm. This is between 10 and 12 kiloohms. Big unit difference there. So what this does is actually put a load on your guitar's electronics. In the same way when you roll the volume knob off on your guitar, it actually kind of changes the load in the pickup system. Same thing's happening here. And the effect is that it has such a fundamental interaction with your pickups that you cannot put anything between here and your guitar that buffers your signal. You're going to have a bad time. In fact, this is the main reason that made this video such a challenge, because most of the time I like to reamp dry files through a pedal and then show you what it sounds like when you change parameters in real time. And you can do that on pedals with high impedance because the guitar doesn't care. It's like, yeah, I don't even see anything really. This is almost like having the circuit in your guitar. You might as well. In fact, a lot of players, particularly like Brian May fans, will take his guitar model and put a treble booster inside it that you can change because it literally does affect your electronics. You also have something, I think it was like the Older Electro Harmonics products had one that you could plug directly into your guitar as well. So super important. And two things to take away from that is, one, it drastically affects the output frequency response. And two, do not put a buffer pedal between here and your guitar. I'll show you a demo here so you can hear what I'm talking about. Fortunately, the output impedance on this circuit is within the realm of sanity. So if you do want to run an overdrive or anything buffered or even unbuffered after this, you'll probably have a fine time with it. If you do want to stack this with, say, a Germanium transistor fuzz pedal, then you might have a conundrum on your hands. In general, people prefer to have this up front most of the time. It's not always the case. But if you're in true bypass and you go around the pedal altogether, then it's really not a problem at all. So just some things you'll have to consider, but my main advice would be, unless you have a tone sucking wah pedal or some other, kind of weird design like this that puts a load on your guitar, then just have this be the first thing in your signal chain, barring a true bypass tuner. And even then, I still might prefer to have this up front just for safety. The final thing to note about this circuit is something you might have already picked up on. So obviously, you have a lot of output headroom here, which is good because you're going to make your amp louder and you can push the front of the preamp and get some natural breakup there. But the transistor itself can have some soft clipping depending on how hard you hit it. And the way this is biased, the way this is built, I can actually get quite a bit of distortion out of this. And it sounds really nice. It's not quite as convincing as some of these solid state pedals you'll hear today and think, oh, that sounds like a preamp tube. But it's a very particularly nice tone that I really enjoy. And this is totally different from, like a modern clean boost pedal with 20 decibels of clean headroom on an op amp, because you can never get some of those things to distort. But this, if you hit it hard with a loud humbucker or P90, you absolutely get some really cool sound. So when you stack a high level, already distorted waveform into something that, may already be fat and on the edge of breakup, then you get some, it's just classic rock. It is the bona fide, late 60s, early 70s rock sound when you have a P90 equipped guitar going through a treble booster, some sort of plexi derivative or Vox, and through a pair or two of greenbacks. That is just the tone. Here's where things get really interesting. When you throw together all of those variables into the soup that is the Rangemaster, whether it be the behavior of the transistor, how the impedance works, how the high pass filter works, you can actually get some really cool volume roll-off behavior on this. And that's why I'm really not even mad that the original effect was always on, because it works really well as an always on thing. Because this is loading down your pickups, if you hit it hard with, say, that P90 example I was using earlier, then you back off to, say, 3.5, 4, you still get a ton of volume. The amp really doesn't get quieter, but as you turn it up, you get natural distortion again. Super important effect, and it sounds amazing. It is a totally different tone than I'm used to, even with clean boost. You still have kind of a noisy, raggedy top end with these germanium transistors that I don't really think carries over to similar designs that use silicon, but again, they both have their advantages and disadvantages. So that is something you'll definitely want to take advantage of. And if you're not someone who, likes to roll off on volume, and I'm not one of those people, then you might have a hard time getting used to a treble booster. But If you can make yourself get used to that mindset, like I finally kind of got through my head, then it's a really powerful tool. With that, let's go over 4 more use cases where I think this circuit shines. And my general philosophy and recommendation would be to buy something that has this full range option, at least something that you can change between the two. There's a few pedals out there that either have like a tone knob or that have a whole bank of capacitors you can choose from, and that would be great. But as long as you have either the standard and the boost or something that has like a 3-way like this one, beautiful. I think the Beano Boost has this exact configuration because, like I said, there are some great use cases. If you have a dark guitar, a dark non-master volume amp, or a dirt box that needs more high-end, either before or after it, treble booster makes complete sense. However, if you are running anything else, especially a single coil guitar into an already kind of jangly amplifier, then you're going to need the full range option. And it's kind of nice that this can handle both of those. So let's start off with that single coil setup. We'll be using a Stratocaster both on the neck and bridge, and you'll hear that through kind of a bright amplifier setup, continue to use this amplifier, that you can still achieve that volume roll-off trick where, around 2.5 to 3, it's still loud, but it's clean. You get some of that gritty top end, and then as you turn it up, you're into almost full fuzz territory, but it's still a different kind of distortion than that. And I think that's why a lot of people confuse old treble booster, or at least modified treble booster tones, with fuzz tones, because it has a very similar characteristic. So this one's a great one. If you're a Strat, Tele, Jazzmaster player, check it out. If you're more of a humbucker player like myself, you can still absolutely get some awesome results with the full range option on this circuit. I have to change some amplifier settings like I did, and perhaps even play with the tone control if you get something that is too honky, depending on what setting you have this on. I do think the full range boost sounds great wide open, so do play around with that. I do really like the volume roll-off behavior on humbuckers. It kind of has this lo-fi thing going on, where it sounds more scooped out or AM radio kind of effect. So give that a shot if you're into that sort of tone. Number 3 is without a doubt my favorite way to use this circuit. That is to crank it all the way up, or damn near all the way up, put the full range boost on, and grab a P90 equipped SG, or in my case, a humbucker size P90, put it through the normal or low input of a plexi style amp, turn it all the way up, you sound like Tony Iommi. It's epic. And one thing to note, Tony also cut the tone controls on his guitars. He never used them. So you will want a full range P90 tone for the early Sabbath stuff. Later Sabbath stuff was humbuckers and just kind of straight through modified amps. But if you want to sound like Black Sabbath, Paranoid, all the way up to Sabotage, I personally find Sabotage tones are awesome on these actual treble boosted tones, then look no further. This is it. Lastly, let's go over one use case where the treble booster stock setting actually makes sense. So I'll be using a really dark drive pedal. It's not dark, on its own, but I've got it dialed in to kind of reflect maybe a blues breaker pedal or something that, sort of sounds like those low, mid, heavy, non-master volume amps I was talking about. I did prefer rolling off my tone control a little bit on the guitar I was using, since it had humbucker, something again I usually never do. But if you play around with your amp settings and the other pedal, and where you have this boosted and volume control, you can absolutely find places where the regular treble booster makes sense. But in my opinion, this is best used to boost other things. I think most amplifiers that you get nowadays, especially if there's a master volume control, it's just really not necessary. But it's still a legacy feature that is worth having around. And that about does it for today's episode of Pedalhead. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed making it. It was a ton of fun, super interesting going back through the lore, you could say, of this circuit and other early circuits like it. Being more of a hard rock, heavy metal guy, a lot of this stuff doesn't really gel with the music that I personally make, though I hope there will be instances along some of the stuff that I write where using stuff like a treble booster or an old fuzz pedal or something like that makes sense, because I find them wholly fascinating, and the people that can play them well sound amazing with them. So if you would like to see more vintage effects like this, whether it be, an old tremolo or, Germanium fuzz or something like that, let me know. Maybe I can grab another clone like this, and who knows, maybe I'll really like it, even though, again, it's really not up my alley. Either way, next episode will be the OCD, so hope to see you then, as long as one other pedal doesn't get here before then, and then if it does, I'll push it back another month. Either way, we're going to have some cool stuff in the next coming few months, so do stick around for that. Thank you so much for watching. Any other questions, comments, as always, please leave them down below. See you next time. Bye.